Welcome, everyone. We are joined today by Carol Hopkins, the CEO of Thunderbird Partnership Foundation. Carol is joining us today to speak on the impact of culture-based interventions. Welcome, Carol.
I'm joining you from southwestern Ontario, the Delaware Nation at Moravian Town. And my mother is from the this same community, also the head office for Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and my father is from the Munsee Delaware First Nation, further towards London. I thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk to you about land-based healing and the land-based healing model that was developed through Thunderbird Partnership Foundation. It was intended to support planning, decision-making, policy to support land-based funded programs, and it was developed along the 5 themes of the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. And you can find a copy of the land-based service delivery model on our website at thunderbirdpf.org. The model itself gives an overview of a variety of land-based programming. It defines what that programming is and why it's necessary by talking about the elements, the principles, and the cultural protocols. It offers a policy framework, including elements of governance, overall operational structure in terms of workforce, safety, client served, and minor capital needs. It also talks about the operational side of programming, so referrals and assessments, the different aspects of land-based programming, and outcome measures. The principles of the land-based programming that we heard through our research were identified through the programs that that we studied, and they focus on the importance of Indigenous knowledge and culture as a foundation for developing program. It also recognizes all of creation as a healer, and so this is from an Indigenous worldview or First Nations worldview that is centered around a spiritual relationship we have with the land and all of the beings on the land, above and below the land. It is about experiential learning. It's community focused, so that knowledge and cultural practices are community based. It's not importing another culture to apply in the environment. It's about its social inclusion, and it's very much scalable. The intent of the land-based programming, like I said, is to facilitate policy and programming. And so in all of the programs that we studied, we saw land-based programming serving the needs for prevention, health promotion, for treatment, and also coordination of care across a number of service delivery programs. It also facilitates healing by giving access to an important determinant of health, that being the land. Many First Nations people or cultures, even across the diversity of language and land, understand the land as our first and true mother, a spiritual mother, if you will, provides for all of life. And so it facilitates a relationship just like the relationship with our biological mother is critically important for attachment. It also teaches about knowledge and knowledge of the land, community history and relationship, transmitting across generations, language, and understanding the land as a teacher and a healer, the foods of the land, medicines, the spiritual connection, the relationship that is critically important for living life well. And on the element of relationality that is required for wellness, specifically the relationship with land, you'll see that as I talk about the Native Wellness Assessment, which is the instrument that helps us to develop and gather evidence on the impact of land-based healing. So the Native Wellness Assessment is made up of two assessments. There's a self-assessment form and an observer rating form. And the observer rating form is typically completed by a helper or a staff person. It doesn't matter whether you're in a residential treatment program, an outpatient treatment program for addictions, or in a land-based program, maybe focused on trauma or overall wellness. The assessment is available for use wherever there are culturally based programs being offered. And the assessment was standardized to give a reliable measure over time. So a baseline someplace near the either before or at the beginning of a service, and someplace along the middle. However, most programs do the baseline and the completion to give two measures, and it's been standardized as a Class B assessment. So the Native Wellness Assessment is a unique instrument because it's based on Indigenous knowledge, and through the Honoring Our Strengths, a renewed framework to address substance use amongst First Nations people in Canada, which was a 4-year conversation that we had across the country with First Nations, who said that our culture and our own knowledge have to inform our approach to addressing substance use and substance use harms. And so when we talked about that, how do we understand culture? What does it look like in practice? How do we know it's working? That led to, there's a research chapter in the Honoring Our Strengths Renewal Framework, and that research chapter talks about the desire to conduct research to demonstrate how our culture works, how Indigenous knowledge makes a difference over time. And so the Native Wellness Assessment is primarily being used in treatment center, but also community-based programs that are using culture to set goals for treatment plans, to monitor change over time, to establish targets and benchmarks, to give the service provider information that can be used for workforce development and program evaluation. So it measures wellness across 4 areas: spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical well-being. And we filtered all of the data that we have from the Native Wellness Assessment over the last 3 years prior to the pandemic, the 3 years prior to the pandemic. And we looked at cultural practices specifically connected to land. And we wanted to pull the data and be able to talk about the difference that land makes. And so specifically looking at the cultural interventions that give a measure of wellness as described by hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. And so there, when we looked at the data, there was 2,900 assessments completed with clients, both from treatment centers and from community, who were participating in culturally based interventions, land-based interventions. And so in the Native Wellness Assessment itself, we identified at least a minimum of 13 statements that had to be completed, indicating connection to land-based practices and knowledge across 3 different groups of cultural practices. So group 1 are cultural activities that would happen on a daily basis or weekly basis. Group 2 might be monthly. Group 3 might be annual kinds of activities. And the Native Wellness Assessment was developed through a CIHR funded research project. And we had 3 core questions. that we asked in a conversation environmental scan that took us across Canada, across different language groups, across different cultures. And our first question was, what makes a whole and healthy person? And of course, people said it's a balance between mind, body, spirit, and emotions. And we said, what from your culture facilitates that whole and healthy person? And so this diagram represents the common cultural practices. It doesn't mean that these cultural practices are all conducted or implemented or facilitated in the same exact way, but First Nations people across the country said our ceremonial practice is critically important to our wellness. What ceremonies, how they're conducted, um, relationship to the seasons, that's all different across the country. But the fact that ceremonial practices do occur in land-based programming is critically important to facilitating wellness. And you can see that the conversation did include specifically land-based activities. So language, land, medicines, ceremony, and teaching the knowledge of connection to land is critically important for facilitating wellness. And so when we filtered the data from the Native Wellness Assessment, we were looking at the cultural practices specifically that were connected to land. And so from 2017 to 2020, we found there was a consistent increase in wellness across time. And that wellness was improved through a variety of programs that were daily over time, 4-week, 6-week programs. The time frame for the land-based activities were all different, but what was consistent is that they all invested in culture to facilitate wellness for people who were in a program to address substance use and addictions, including opioid and methamphetamine addiction. The Native Wellness Assessment was implemented also in programs for family violence. The Native Wellness Assessment is also used by programs that are facilitating access to culture and land in a health promotion environment. And so what we saw is a consistent increase in the quadrants of belonging and purpose. Now, belonging is about emotional wellness. Purpose is about physical wellness. Those two are consistent across time. And at the bottom of the screen, you see those little boxes. And what they indicate is a connection to culture. So the Native Wellness Assessment doesn't measure the absence of deficits or the change in substance use. It measures wellness that is defined from Indigenous knowledge and culture. And we wanted to make sure that it was culture that we were measuring and not another aspect of the program, cognitive behavioral therapy, matrix counseling, or other things. It was about measuring and demonstrating the strength of culture through the connection to the land. And so across time, then we also looked at what is the connection to those cultural practices for both male and female. And the Native Wellness Assessment was standardized for adults and youth. And now I use the binary male, female categories here, but the Native Wellness Assessment also asks about other genders as well. And so for land-based services specifically, we see that consistent improvement in belonging and purpose. And so on the screen is the Indigenous wellness framework with the outcomes on the outside, the outcomes being hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. And so if we are investing in Indigenous wellness through culture, then at a spiritual level, that programming or those culturally based practices will reflect the values of the people, their belief system or their worldview, and attend specifically to their identity. So the way that um, First Nations people in the Yukon practice culture or the relationship with their own spirituality is going to be very different than the way we practice culture and spirituality in Southwestern Ontario. It's important that it's reflective of the land where the people are and their language and worldview. So if we, so the third, so let me pause there. I'm getting tripped up on my words. If we're investing in spiritual wellness in those three ways, then the outcome of that investment should be measured by the extent to which the individual experiences an increase in hope in their life. And likewise for the emotional, mental, and physical behavior and wellness. And so there are 13 indicators that support wellness at spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical level of our being. Now, emotional wellness and physical wellness are critically important when we are talking about addictions. And depending on the type of addiction or the substance being used, we're not going to start with, say, if it's opioids, for example. The first line of intervention is not addressing the unresolved trauma or the emotional wellness. It's going to be in the physical quadrant and understanding that the impacts of opioids and the withdrawal have to, and the way that it impacts, we have to start from the physical self. And so there's a certain way of doing things to address the withdrawals and support somebody in addressing the opioid addiction. That's the first place you start. So it's not surprising when we look at the results from land-based services that facilitate access to land and cultural practices at the same time that people are receiving medicine, such as buprenorphine, naloxone, or the naloxone kits to save people's lives. That's about physical wellness. And it's providing services in a certain way. And just like naloxone saves people's lives, people who are experiencing a connection to land in the supportive environment of elders have also said that those practices are about saving their life because it's anchoring them in facilitating a connection with an environment that is non-judgmental, non-stigmatizing, non-discriminatory. When they're out on the land, it's just complete and total acceptance. So that sense of belonging to the land, to the people around them, those relationships that are created help to facilitate a connection. So the two balance each other, belonging and purpose. This is significant for land-based services. And if you would like to know more about the Native Wellness Assessment or the land-based service delivery model, please visit our website. Again, that's thunderbirdpf.org. We published 5 articles on the development of the Native Wellness Assessment, and you can also find the land-based service delivery model there. And you can also find our annual training calendar and look for land-based service delivery. We have a train the trainer model that also is supported by a community of practice. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Open to questions. I went through that information really, really quickly. And there's lots more that I could share about the development of the land-based service delivery model that actually has roots in the Yukon. The board of directors for our organization went to the Yukon specifically to hear a presentation about land-based services. Our director at that time was Debbie Nagano, and she was from the Gwich'in First Nation, and she talked about, in the absence of residential treatment centers, that one of the strengths of First Nations in the Yukon was land-based services. And so the board of directors went there to hear a presentation that was delivered by Jeannie Dendies, who talked about the program at Jackson Lake being initiated through the Justice Program. Following that presentation, it ignited further interest and conversation from across Canada, where we talked with not only residential treatment programs for addictions, but community-based programs to understand all of the different ways that land-based services are delivered. And then when Canada was developing the first mental wellness programs, many of the mental wellness teams that were developed across the country were developed around land-based programming.
Thank you very much for this, Carol. And I also want to remind everyone that if you don't have a question right now, but you think of something later, there is an opportunity to submit that question on the feedback form within this session. And those can be sent to Carol for her to answer at a later date. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.